First of all, I want to apologize for this course being late. I just came back from teaching a grad school in South Africa, and that has somewhat perturbed the planning for this course. Um, so, what this second theme, I believe, in the second part of the OMNI course is about is livestock diseases or diseases of livestock. And well, you can see the date here is March because that was when I was supposed to start teaching this course. And of course, as you know, things went a little south. So this first lecture is just to provide an introduction to the topic. We'll get into the modeling itself in the next few lectures. So I'm again traveling. I am planning to record some of those lectures while traveling. If I can't do that, I will still put slides online that you will have access to. And I will record lectures once I'm back at the end of the week. Today is Sunday, 6th or 7th of April. So next Sunday, I'll have a bunch of other videos if I don't have them before that. Okay, so diseases of livestock. As I've already indicated, this is the second theme in the second part of the OMNI RÉUNIS course. And this is one where really the One Health component is going to go through quite acutely because livestock diseases really have, they embody in some sense the One Health approach. So what I want to do is spend a little time just giving you some ideas about the topic. And I am not going to go into much detail, okay, but I'm still going to explain a little bit what this is about. So first of all, I'll talk about the different terms we'll be using in this course, and then I'll focus on diseases of livestock. And then I'll go through 4 examples mostly, which have different scope essentially. And I'll explain when we get there. So the first thing that I want to do is spend a little time on vocabulary. So what's an animal disease to start with? So first of all, I'll point out it's quite interesting. I actually hadn't followed that evolution. The World Organization for Animal Health used to be called OIE, or Organisation Internationale des Epizooties, but it has changed its name to an English acronym last year. So this is quite recent. So it's been around for a while. It's essentially the pendant to WHO for animal diseases. And WOHA, I don't know how we say that, WOHA, has 117 diseases that it calls listed. So there's a table essentially of diseases there. Additionally to that, it lists also several emerging diseases and a few important diseases, but that are not listed yet. Together with more than 50 wildlife diseases that could have impact on livestock health and public health and etc. Okay, so if you think about animal diseases, there's the wildlife conservation aspect that's relevant and that we're not going to talk too much about in this course because we're going to focus on diseases of livestock. But WOA also has some components about wildlife diseases, even in the absence of transmission to livestock. We'll see that a lot of the potential impact of wildlife diseases is that they can be transmitted to livestock. So first of all, I asked everybody's favorite system right now, ChatGPT, for a definition. which, as always with ChatGPT, if you don't get into too much detail, you get something that is quite appropriate. So, and I've emphasized a few words, but so an animal disease in general, it's any illness or infection or health condition that affects animals, whether they are domesticated or wild. There's a wide range of infectious agents that are at play. So viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites. If you remember, that is essentially the content of my course in the previous term, environmentally transmitted pathogens. But there are those, there's toxins as well. Uh, the diseases they impact a variety of body systems. So um, we'll go through that, okay? So in animal diseases, they have significant impact, as I was saying before, on animal health, the welfare, and the productivity. And there are intrusions into the public health, so the human health aspect, and as well as the economy. So they list here a few diseases: foot and mouth disease, bovine tuberculosis, brucellosis, African swine fever. We'll go through foot and mouth and bovine tuberculosis, and in the main part of the course, we'll come back to several different diseases. Now, given an animal disease, there is one particular aspect that is critical in One Health framework. It's zoonosis. So a zoonosis is a disease that's caused by germs uh, that spread between animals and people. Okay, so we call a zoonosis an infectious disease that has jumped from a non-human animal to a human, and they have the same origins as the animal diseases, but the name here is used to really refer to a disease that originates in animals and makes its way to humans. And of course, we've heard a lot of that. They represent, recently with COVID, for example, they represent a major public health problem due to the close relationship that you can find in terms of animals being present either in agriculture or in companion, in like as pets, or even because you encounter them in the wild. And zoonoses have potential impact. And that's going to be essentially the recurrent theme in this topic of livestock diseases, is that these diseases have a potential major impact on the economy for a variety of reasons. Again, I asked everybody's friend, ChatGPT, and you have a definition here. As always, I will post the slides and you can go to the slides. So a zoonosis or a zoonotic disease is an infectious disease that can be transmitted from animals to humans, directly, indirectly, caused by the usual suspects: viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi, and transmitted through a variety of routes that are so bites, scratches, consumption of food that is contaminated, or water, etc. So here, zoonoses, they list rabies, Lyme disease, avian influenza, which we will also talk about in today's lecture. And again, they can pose significant public health challenges because they can lead to widespread outbreaks and pandemics, which we'll talk about briefly when we talk about avian influenza. So this is from the CDC, and as always, if you remember now, to make the slides easier to see on a black background, I invert the background, which gives some weird color to the slides, but never mind. So this is an illustration of what a zoonotic disease is. Okay, so with animals and people, and things go back and forth between the two. Now, they have an enormous impact. So this is a citation from a paper that cites another paper, but they point out that in 2001 it was documented that 61% of all human pathogens are zoonotic. Okay. And of 175 newly emerging pathogens, 75% are zoonotic. So not only do diseases of animals cause problems to animal populations, to the production of food, etc., but there's also a very direct potential impact on human health. The last term that I want to go briefly over is what's an epizooty or epizootic. So an epizooty, again, ChatGPT, refers to the sudden outbreak or occurrence of a highly contagious and widespread disease. So this is like an epidemic, okay? In other words, this is an epidemic, but it's an epidemic for animals. So this is exactly the same term we use for humans as epidemics. We call epizooty in an animal case. Okay? And again, there's an emphasis on the economic losses, and I'm going to talk about this in the remainder of the lecture. So this is zoonosis in general, diseases of animals and so on, but now let's focus on diseases of livestock, which is the topic of this course. So these diseases that affect livestock, they're important for several reasons, which I sort of summarize here. They have potential very important economic consequences. They have consequences on food availability, food safety. Okay, so they can lead to lack, disappearance of food. And they also have this third aspect that I mentioned, which is that they can be transmitted to humans. Okay, and I've again, as usual, I have linked some reports. There's some interesting documents from the World, from WOHA and the Food and Alimentation Organization of the UN, etc. Okay, so you'll have a bunch of links to things to read. So to give you an example, this is a figure I took from a paper that was published, I think, in the late 1990s or early 2000s. I don't know, early 2000s, because there's SARS. And this is a sort of summary of the impact of several diseases, some of which are human, some of which are in the food processing. So you can see E. coli and Listeria. And this is an estimate of the cost of those outbreaks. So you can see SARS, and that's SARS-CoV-1. Okay, it's not SARS-CoV-2, but it's estimated to have cost Asia about $50 billion. Listeria, so foodborne pathogens, about 7 billion a year, and that's quite a few years ago. Salmonellosis is also a problem, like costs 1 billion a year. UK BSC, sorry, we will talk about this. Not quite directly, but you can see that it cost the UK more than $9 billion, etc. Okay, so there's a variety here, influenza A in Hong Kong, etc. Now, if we focus on disease outbreaks that are diseases typically of cattle or livestock, actually, I say that, and the first one is rabies, so forget about livestock. But okay, this tells you the number of outbreaks in the period under consideration in this paper, how long the outbreak typically lasts, and how much million US dollars it costs per month to deal with an outbreak like this. So TSE here is transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. Nah. Okay, like the mad cow and that type of thing. We'll talk about scabies, which is one such disease. You can see that these outbreaks lasted very long and at an average cost of $10 million a month. So these have so number of outbreaks, you can see 33, avian influenza, typically there's 33 of them. It lasts about 10 months to get rid of it, and every month that you're dealing with it, it costs you about $10 million. I mean, these things have an impact that is non-negligible. Yes, and I've just explained here some of the terms you see in the previous table. Um, so AI is avian influenza, not artificial intelligence. TSE is transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. These are prion diseases, okay. And Q fever is a bacterial disease. Now, let's look at a bit more detail of this. This is another paper. The sources of the figures are listed if you go to the markdown file, so the original for those slides. You will see that I have the link to the different papers. So here you can see the value of the impact. So FMD is foot and mouth disease, 8 billion British pounds for the 2001 UK outbreak, that I will talk about in a few minutes. Foot and mouth disease cost about 21 billion. Just looking at production losses and vaccination costs. Okay. Highly pathogenic avian influenza H7N9. So there's $6.5 billion. H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza, 5 to 10 billion. Foot and mouth disease, I don't remember what are all of those. But you can see what I really want to stress here, there's an economic cost to these diseases that is staggering. I've got a few more here. Again, highly pathogenic avian influenza. You've got a bunch of costs here. And now I'm going to go into a bit more detail about some of those diseases. Okay. So just really I want to stress, and it shouldn't sound like it's only about the economy. It is not only about the economy, but it has, these diseases have enormous impacts. And I'll come back to that in a second. So I'm going to look at, I think, 4 diseases. I'm going to talk about them a little bit. They all have potential global implications, but I'm thinking more about the scale of the outbreaks. Okay, the transmission events. I'm going to start with transmission events that are more local, and then I'll make my way up to a more global aspect. And because when we look at models in the remainder of this course, the same thing is going to happen. Some of the models are going to be acting at the level of a population, and some models are going to be considering more global events, and that is a little bit because of the type of problem that we consider, and I want to illustrate this. So the first example is scrapie. So what is scrapie? It's a TSE, okay, it's a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. It's like BSE, but it occurs in sheep and goats. And here you can see these are spots. I don't know exactly how they are called, but that are detected in the matter of the infected animals. Okay, it's a degenerative disease. It is fatal all the time, and it affects the nervous system of animals. It's called scrapie in English because it is one of the symptoms of scrapie is you can see here an animal that has scraped itself. Okay, it's they scrape off their fleeces against rock, trees, or fences. Okay. Other clinical signs include excessive lip smacking, altered gaits, and convulsive collapse. And just a remark in passing, it's quite interesting how things work sometimes. In French, we call tremblante du mouton, and it means the sheep is convulsing. So the name is also, the name of a disease in French is also based on a symptom, but it's not the same symptom we use in English. Okay. Now, I should point out, so these disease, scabies, for example, is a disease which um, is typically affects more smaller herds, and there's I don't remember that there would be a widespread spread epidemic of scabies, but it is something that is taken very seriously also. Um, Second example I want to talk about briefly is foot and mouth disease, hoof and mouth disease if you're from the UK. And I should point out that this is not hand, foot, and mouth disease, which is a disease that the kids get typically. But okay, so what is it? Uh, it's a viral disease. It affects mostly cattle and swine. It also affects sheep, goats, deer, and other things with cloven hoofed animals. Horses are not affected. Um, Elephants, hedgehogs, and some rodents are susceptible, etc. Okay, so this is an example of the virus. Um, Now, what happens is that an animal that's infected develops fever and blister-like sores on its tongue and mouth, and you can see here a picture. This is a blister on the mouth of a cow. Um, Affected animals recover typically, but the disease leaves them weakened and debilitated. So just as an example, I mentioned this when I was talking about the economic impact. In 2001, there was an outbreak in the UK where there was about 2,000 cases. But to deal with the outbreak, the authorities in the UK culled about more than 6 million cows and sheep. That had profound impacts on farming in the UK. Okay, some people lost their entire herds. Um, there was some debate about the measures as they were taken, but the epidemic was eventually contained. Whether that was essentially what had to be done is another problem. But so, for example, you had this contiguous cull, which concerned mostly sheep. If you had sheep within 3 kilometers of a known case, you had to slaughter the entire herd. That didn't apply to cows as much, um, but that had tremendous impact. And just as a sort of an aside, but to see to explain a little bit what can happen, one of my siblings, my sister, used to raise horses in France, and in 2001 there were a few. I think in France it was mostly, I think, 2 cases, but they still put in place very strict containment measures and she was, so horses are not if affected by the disease, but they can be carriers. Okay. And so what happened in most of Europe, and in particular in the UK, was that there were restrictions on the movement of animals. And so, for example, my sister was not able to sell a single horse for, I don't remember how many months, because it was not possible to move animals between farms, just to prevent potential spread of the disease. Now, so BSE, sorry, foot and mouth disease had an impact throughout the UK. I mean, and we will come back to foot and mouth disease in the modeling part. Okay, it's a well-studied example on which a lot of modeling took place, and it also has a very nice data set. So we'll come back to it. Another example that I want to talk about is bovine tuberculosis. So bovine tuberculosis is so we saw a TSE type disease with scabies. We saw a viral disease, which was foot and mouth disease, and here we're back in bacterial diseases. So bovine tuberculosis is tuberculosis. It's a bacterial disease of livestock, and sometimes it also affects other mammals. It results from infection with a Mycobacterium bovis. Okay, and so these are some samples of infected tissues, and at a larger scale, these are infected tissue organs. Now, very much like human tuberculosis, and by the way, so some humans can be infected by bovine tuberculosis sometimes. It's not frequent, but it can happen. Similarly to classic, let's say, human tuberculosis, the bacteria may be dormant in an infected animal for years. Okay. And then at some point, it could cause clinical signs of what are called progressive disease symptoms. It can reactivate during periods of stress or when animals become older and their immune system becomes less competent. And I'll point out that in most Western countries, there are very, very strict protocols in terms of dealing with bovine tuberculosis. So in Canada, for instance, it's very rare to see advanced stages of a disease because most of the cases are detected very early, and it's rare to see progression to clinical signs. So, but it's really quite important in terms of the potential impact because animals with infected with a progressive disease, they can shed the bacteria in secretions, in feces and milk, urine, etc. And movement of an infected animal from one herd to another increases the risk of disease transmission. And you can see that here I have, well, okay, I have a variety of animals shown. And as I said, it is also potentially transmitted to humans. It's more accidental, but it can happen. And what's really important is that here you have a stage, this middle stage here, this is herds, okay? This is domesticated animals. But the disease is present in the wildlife, and it's there as a reservoir. And so there is potential for transmission from the wildlife into the livestock. And that is going to be one of the main sources of contamination. So in Canada, I'll take two examples. So in Canada, as I said before, there is a very strict protocol. So bovine TB is a reportable disease. Suspected cases must be reported to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and also to provincial in most provinces, I think all provinces. It also needs to be reported to provincial authorities. If a bovine TB case is confirmed by CFIA, the CFIA alerts health departments and implements strict disease eradication to eliminate the infection and prevent spread to wildlife and to humans. So, as often with diseases of livestock, this means that a lot of animals are slaughtered preventively. Okay, so this is what happens. These are the control measures in place in Canada. Implement quarantine, restrict movement of animals and equipment, because equipment can become contaminated. Destruction of all infected and susceptible exposed animals. Okay, humane, but nonetheless destruction. Cleaning and disinfection of infected premises and equipment, investigation and testing of all at-risk livestock herds. Okay, testing livestock and wildlife within a surveillance zone, and testing any livestock herds that are restocked onto the premises where the TB was previously confirmed. Okay, so you can see that the protocol for dealing with bovine TB is very strict in Canada. But I'll point out that this is a global issue. Okay, so 44% of countries member of OIE or WAHO reported TB case, bovine TB cases in a period of a year and a half when it was still OIE. Okay, so imagine that's almost half of the countries that reported cases of bovine tuberculosis, but only a quarter of the affected countries applied the type of measures I was talking about that hold in Canada. And why is that important? Is that it's in particular, so you can see here, yes, bovine TB is present in wildlife in a variety of countries where you have pastoralism, for instance, so people that are that are sort of nomadic, but carrying their in charge of their herds. Okay, and this disease has the potential to really affect their entire livelihood. Okay, and it's present everywhere in the world. So here you can see I've taken, so some of my slides are in French. I mean, this is a bilingual program, but I will explain what this is about. So this is the prevalence, apparent prevalence, so the observed prevalence of bovine TB based on bibliographic data from between 1969 and 2010, and human cases of bovine TB declared in 2007 in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see that bovine TB affects quite a lot of countries here. Okay, it is so. For example, you can see that Burkina Faso here is quite high. I'll come back to this example later. In Chad, for instance, it's also relatively high. And you can see, so this is still apparent prevalence rate of bovine tuberculosis in bovine animals in sub-Saharan Africa as a function of the type of geography and the type of system of raising animals. So where is this? So this is particularly important here. Okay, this is pastoral livestock keeping. Extensive pastoral livestock keeping and transhumant means that animals are taken to fields in different locations as a function of the season and so on. And you can see that this is the apparent tuberculosis rates, and you can see that sometimes they're quite high. Okay, so for example, this is Chad. I'll come back to Chad later. I have students in Chad, and one of my students is working on this type of disease because it's very important in the sort of the agriculture system there. So regarding zoonotic TB, the WAHO has put together WOA, this acronym is, the OIE has put together a list of 10 goals. And here I've linked a very interesting webpage. I recommend you take a look. It's really well done about zoonotic diseases, TB in particular. And it's a call for action in terms of collecting data. And so this is the first goal. It's to gather more data, more accurate data about the animal and human populations in the regions that are affected by this. Improve diagnosis, address research gaps, and ensure safer food, which is really important. Improve animal health, reduce the risk to people. Okay. The others are more political, but those are really important goals. And as I said, I mean, there are people whose entire livelihood depend on these livestock, and it's complicated. Just one slide that I wanted to show. This is FAO, and it's about pastoralism in Chad, but they're advocating for a development of this, but using responsible investments. And in that whole discussion about pastoralism and food safety, etc., in both regions, the problem of infectious diseases of livestock is one that comes up in every single discussion. The last disease I want to briefly talk about is avian influenza. So that's the disease with the biggest global reach, and I'll explain why. Okay. So avian influenza is typically caused by influenza A viruses. It's adapted to bird, but one of the big fears with avian influenza is that it can also stably adapt and sustain person-to-person transmission in humans. Okay, so that disease is probably the one with the most potential impact, direct impact in human populations. I shouldn't say impact because, as I said before, the diseases that cause people to lose their livelihood, lose their food sources, are also directly impacting humans. But here, this is a disease that can become pathogenic to humans. So there's two types of avian influenza. They're classified in terms of their pathogenicity. The one that we fear the most is the one that's called HPAI, so high pathogenicity avian influenza. For example, the most well-known one is H5N1. It's an emerging avian influenza virus that is understood to have potential pandemic threat. It's killed millions of poultry through Asia, Europe, and Africa. And one of the ideas is that, well, there's human flu viruses and avian flu viruses, and there is a potential for populations that coexist close to avian influenza affected species, that there could be recombination of viruses, and that that could lead to influenza strains that would be easily transmitted in humans. And one of the main causes of concern is that the few cases we have observed, I mean, there are cases that are known for it to be um, derived from avian sources, but when we really have an avian influenza in humans, the case fatality ratio is typically not very good at all. So 60% case fatality ratio is humongous. But that is not to say that if such a disease went pandemic, we would keep that type of CFR, of course. But I mean, as a starting point, that's quite enormous. And avian influenza is a global concern because it involves multiple bird species, mostly waterfowls, but not only. Um, and it involves wild and livestock bird species. And the important thing is that birds fly. So let me show you a few interesting pictures that I've taken here and there. Being based in Canada, in a region where we see a lot of migration of Canada geese, but also pelicans and all sorts of waterfowls. Um, this is the yearly migration from bird species that are spending their summer essentially in the boreal forest of northern Canada and a little bit of Alaska, and how they spread throughout the entire American continent. Okay, so you're going to see that these birds travel, and they travel everywhere. So this is a bunch of animal, well, different birds here, and you can see the different routes. This is a National Geographic picture. You can see the different routes throughout Africa and Eurasia and the Australia, Australasia, etc. And you can see that most of those bird species really have a long range. Okay? They can cover quite a lot of ground. And so this is something I found on the Alaska, I think. Uh, and they present this as being positive, which is true. Highways in the sky connect Alaska to the world. But what's important here is you can see that, well, also Alaska connects one continent and several other continents in terms of bird species that are moving from one place to another. And because those bird species may harbor an avian influenza virus, well, that has potential enormous consequences in terms of the spatial and temporal dissemination of the pathogen. So these are, I've listed a few known cases. So these are avian influenza instances throughout the years. So this is the type of strain. So A in chickens, so this is an H5N1, this is an H7N3, etc. There's a variety of different viruses here. Strains of influenza and the type of impact that it had, and you can see, so I don't know if it's accelerated or it's because we've become more aware. There's a bit of both probably, but you can see a variety of cases, 14 million birds here. These are the last few cases reported there. You can see one in Canada, for example, in 2004. These now are transmissions to humans. So these are the number of cases and between parentheses, the number of deaths resulting from avian influenza contaminations in humans. And this is the source of a contamination in humans. And you can see that sometimes the case fatality ratio is really high. So there were 29 cases, of which 20 died, 17 cases, of which 12 died. So that's why this disease is taken very seriously also in terms of its impact on humans. This is a website. I can show you. This is HPAI detections in Europe, and you can use that website, and you get it'll tell you what is happening here. So for example, I'll show you data on this soon, because this is an example that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so you can play with that. Except that I don't know how to go to the next page. So yes, this is so I come from this area in southwest France, somewhere around here, and what people do in the area is they make a lot of ducks and geese for a variety of food products, and these ducks and geese are typically raised in, depends, some of them are in farms, but some of them are in open farms. And in 2021 and 2022, there was a big outbreak of avian influenza. And so all these places that had ducks or geese that were able to roam free, of course, the birds are coming in from outside, landing in the fields, potentially contaminating the livestock. And so that had a tremendous impact during that period. So there's an episode that lasted from essentially August 2021 to May 2022. And I'll translate this: by mid-October 2022, almost 22 million palmiped is webbed feet and chicken, poultry, had been culled in France in the context of the trying to contain the spread of this avian influenza. And by the end of the pandemic episode, so in June 2022, there were 1,378 locations where avian influenza, highly pathogenic avian influenza, had been noted. This was in the livestock situation, 72 cases in the wild area, and 35 cases in people who keep livestock in not a farming proper, but you have a few chicken, etc. So so you can see the impact. So at that time they culled almost 22 million animals, which means that first of all, you have a culling of the animals, which is not great. Then you have people whose entire livelihood went away, etc. So the impact of these diseases is widespread. But on top of that, it being avian influenza, you have that potential to transmission to humans, which is sort of taken into account. And just last few words before I finish, and to set the stage for what we will be doing later. So as I sort of try to point out here, the diseases of livestock, they're widespread, and they attack both highly organized food production systems, so Western type high volume context, but also more traditional food production systems. As I mentioned, so bovine tuberculosis affects pastoral settings as well. Okay. They threaten the livelihood of many, many people. So these diseases can wipe out all sorts of revenue for entire segments of the population. They threaten food security. They can cause famines. And they also, in some cases, have potential pathogenic consequences in humans. So they are very important components of the epidemiological world, let's say, and they need to be studied. And that's what the rest of this course will be about. As I said, I'm hoping to have videos sometime in the coming week. In the worst case, I will have the slides and the videos will follow in 7 days.